Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. My name's Dan Lizette. This is episode 115. Very happy that you guys could join us again. This week's episode's brought to you by listeners like you, supporting the show on Patreon. There's a link in the show notes for the Patreon campaign. It would mean a lot to me if you guys went over and checked that out and made a donation as small as $1 a month. This week's show is also brought to you by Podbean, podcast hosting and monetization. It's the easiest way to start podcasting if you go to podbean.com/TPD. You'll learn more and you'll get your first month free. Tell you more about that in just a little while. But this week's show is a big one of the hottest shows of 2016, the second half anyways, has been a show from American Public Media, APM Reports, more specifically a division of American Public Media called In the Dark. It is an investigative podcast looking back at a 1989 abduction of a small child in rural Minnesota. It's an amazing show and one that I was completely enthralled with. I think I caught on somewhere around episode 4 of its 9-episode run, and I was anxiously awaiting each new episode as it was released, and I knew very early on that I would love to talk to somebody from In the Dark, and it is my pleasure to have had the chance to speak with the host, Madeleine Baran. She's responsible not just for the narration you hear in the show, but also a whole bunch of the investigative journalism that was done looking back at this case in the investigation and the people surrounding this show. It is one that I could not give a more full-throated recommendation on. It is truly one of the best shows of this year, really. And the feedback, I think, bears that out. You see the show talked about a lot, and it's got a lot of critical acclaim, and justifiably so, in my opinion. So I really hope that you guys enjoyed this conversation. It was a real thrill to talk to Madeleine, and without further ado, let's get to my conversation with Madeleine Baran from In the Dark. Hello, folks, and welcome back to the Podcast Digest. As I mentioned up front, I'm very excited to be joined by my guest this week, a show in the second half of 2016 that I became a super fan of very quickly, and I have a feeling that a lot of you did too. It's called In the Dark from APM Reports, and I'm honored to be joined by the host of that show, Madeleine Baran. Welcome to the Podcast Digest.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining me. Lots to talk about with this show, and a lot of people are talking about it. So I'd like to kind of let folks know a little bit about how this excellent work that you guys have done came together. But before we jump into that, for folks who have never heard you before, if you could take a minute, Madeleine, tell folks a little bit about yourself long before In the Dark kicked off.
Yeah, so I've been a reporter for a number of years. I was always interested in investigative reporting, longer reporting, and had done a fair amount of it before In the Dark. But this was our first attempt at a podcast. So in the past, I've covered, the last project I worked on right before this was a about 2-year-long investigation that revealed a cover-up of clergy sexual abuse in the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis. And before that, I've worked on other investigative projects and also just worked in a newsroom as just a general assignment reporter covering everything from, road closures and blizzards to crime and politics and all that.
So lots of happiness all the time is what You're working on.
Yeah, this does not tend to be investigative reporting is not generally a field that is super cheerful and light. But yeah, I mean, I got into journalism because I wanted to do this type of work. That these are the kind of stories that I just feel so strongly about telling. So yeah, I've been lucky to be able to do that.
It's been a hot topic lately. Just to kind of take a quick diversion, investigative journalism seems to be this underfunded, undervalued type of thing. As an active participant in that arena for a while now, does this feel as if something that just not enough attention is given to? You mentioned the Archdiocese and all that, and obviously most people know about the movie coming out of Boston, and the name's escaping me now.
Spotlight.
There you go.
Yeah.
And that was like, it must have been a huge seismic event for investigative journalism, because it really shone a light on not just that issue, but probably the industry as a whole. But how does it feel nowadays to be in this line of work?
Well, there's definitely not enough people working as investigative reporters. I'm in a kind of unusual situation, unfortunate situation, in that American Public Media has last year created an investigative reporting unit, a national unit that I was part of the creation of it and part of now. But a lot of places are doing the opposite. They're cutting the newsroom. They're cutting investigative reporting in particular. This is not cheap work. This takes time. It costs money. And, when you're looking for places to cut, unfortunately, this is a place that a lot of newsrooms look to. And, I think that people do recognize, though, the difference between, thinly reported stories and investigative work. And so I do think that there are ways in which podcasts and, direct to Netflix documentaries like Making a Murderer should show the people who control resources in the news world that there is an audience for this kind of work, and there are people that want this. And after all, this is one of the main values of journalism, to tell you things about powerful people and institutions that those people do not want you to know about, but that is critical in a democracy. So we don't know, without investigative reporting, we don't know all of the things that we would have known with it. If you think about like the Pentagon Papers, if, Daniel Ellsberg had never given those to reporters and those reporters had never published them, or the Snowden revelations, or the reporting on the Catholic Church, how much different our world would be if we didn't know these things. And, so I hope that newsrooms will fund this work, or, other places are finding ways to fund it. There's a lot of online news organizations that have invested money into investigative reporting, or at least some. But yeah, it is, it's not, definitely, most reporters are not in the United States are not working as investigative reporters. But the ones who are, there is a very dedicated group of investigative reporters. There's a conference every year put on by this investigative reporters and editors that has, hundreds and hundreds of reporters from all over the United States who are so committed to this work, even in the face of all of these, layoffs and cutbacks and all of that.
It is so sad that I think we all can probably recognize in our own line of work a time when the dollar forced a decision that we knew was wrong or we didn't agree with, and the fact that some of these newsrooms are cutting these types of areas is perfectly sad. I think about growing up all the time, and still on to this day, 60 Minutes, Dateline NBC, some of the stories, boy, I tell you what, I can get hooked into one of those shows, and it's because so often, what they're uncovering is something I wasn't aware of at all, and you come away feeling as if, you've learned something about the world or some piece of the world, and I couldn't echo your sentiments anymore. It's extraordinarily important, and I too, like you, hope not only does it not get reduced to a point that we're not uncovering those stories, but that hopefully it gets expanded.
Yeah, because in a democracy, if you do not have a strong press, what you're saying is these institutions, whether they're government, business, schools, banks, churches, that we're just going to let them go unexamined, and we're just going to take their word for it that they're doing everything right.
You mentioned real quick your work with the Catholic Church, shot in the dark, and I'm probably connecting two things that shouldn't be. But right after Spotlight either came out on Blu-ray, Reveal did a follow-up story of sort of post-movie, and they went all over in different things. Were you guys a part of that as well?
Yeah, so they ended up including a story. I did a condensed version of a story I'd previously reported for them for that show. Yeah, so we had, yeah. It's probably
as soon as you said it, I'm like, the light bulb went off. Yes.
Yeah, no, so our reporting was from 2013 to 2015, and it revealed a decades-long cover-up of clergy sexual abuse that was continuing to the present day in this diocese in Minnesota that had always portrayed itself as a national leader, as a reformer, as a place that was doing things right. And so the revelations that, long after the Boston crisis, long after this was supposed to be behind the church, that it wasn't, those revelations had a huge impact in Minnesota and led to the archdiocese filing for bankruptcy, the archdiocese being criminally charged, hundreds of people who've been abused by priests coming forward, other resignations, other changes. So it was a pretty big story here, and something that people just did not know about, and for the most part did not even suspect that this would be something that would be still going on up to the present day.
Unbelievable. And I knew you were up in Minnesota, and then you mentioned that part of the story with the Catholic Church, and I recalled, I was like, I think you guys were part of the Reveal episode, and I got a little bit of memory left. So let's get back on track. Well, sorry for the tangent there, but you've been doing investigative journalism for a while. Talk to me about sort of when the idea origination for In the Dark began.
Sure. So I was working on the Archdiocese project, and one day I just got, kind of distracted or with whatever I was doing. And like so many of us, I just ended up on the internet. And I don't even know how I stumbled upon reading all these articles about this case, the abduction of Jacob Wetterling, but I did. And, for me, not being from Minnesota, not having been, certainly not, not old enough to have been a reporter covering the case, I just had this idea that people in Minnesota have about this case, that it wasn't solved because it was unsolvable, that the reason why 27 years had passed with no progress was because this was like the worst kind of mystery. And so when I was reading about the case, right away, the picture that people had been led to believe wasn't matching the basic facts of the case. Like I say in the podcast, there were witnesses to his abduction. The police got there right away, that this happened in a place of just 3,000 people with almost no roads, that all of these things made me wonder, why hasn't this been solved? And also, what was really going on here? How is it possible this wasn't solved, and what were the consequences of that? And so that it started with just that kind of curiosity. And then I was still working on this other project. So I just created like a folder in my inbox, and I just started putting things in there that I would come across, and didn't do anything else with it until I was done with that project, and then did some more research and felt pretty confident that there was a story that hadn't been told yet about this case. And so then I pitched it to my editors, and they created a team around it, and we got started.
So it was basically taking a story that you had stumbled upon,
right,
and realizing that there was a lot more to it. So for folks who aren't familiar with In the Dark, and one, you're crazy, go subscribe right now. You definitely are going to want to hear this show. But this surrounds a disappearance of a young boy in 27 years ago, right? And abduction and disappearance, and then just nothing. There was sort of no news for a very long time. And you said that locally there was kind of this assumed narrative around that. Talk a little bit more about that. What was that? That was it that the investigative departments like the sheriff's office, et cetera, had bumbled things, or was that really not out there yet? No.
That was definitely not out there. So the thinking about the case, in story after story, was, that this was just a classic whodunit. That everyone, worked their hardest, worked their smartest, but it just could not be solved. And there was, unprecedented efforts to solve it, just in terms of manpower. So it wasn't, it's the sheriff's office, local police, but also the FBI, the National Guard, the State Crime Bureau, the Department of Natural Resources, officers in other states, the kind of resources that most cases are not going to get 5% of were given to this case. At the height of it, there were maybe about 100 investigators working on this case. And there were these scenes, of hundreds of people like locking arms in fields and walking through these fields searching for Jacob. It really was an extraordinarily large investigation. And so it's definitely true that people worked very hard on the case. But the kind of second assumption that they did the best that anyone could do was something that I questioned, the more reporting I did. So yeah, so in Minnesota, the kind of narrative of it is law enforcement, worked tirelessly and as best they could, as best anyone could. But the case was just not solvable. There weren't enough helpful clues. There wasn't any evidence. There was just this mystery. And, therefore, there was not really, there wasn't a narrative of why can't law enforcement solve this case? I mean, the coverage was very deferential to law enforcement, that law enforcement, was doing everything it could. And I mean, of course, law enforcement wanted to solve the case. And, I've talked to the investigators who were working back then, and they were working, 18-hour, 20-hour days. They weren't seeing their family. But the question was, well, what kind of work were they doing? And were they doing the kind of work that would be considered, best practices? And that whole part of it had not been explored. And I think one of the reasons was because, there was a lot of preoccupation on the part of reporters with who did it. And understandably, but, that's where a lot of the coverage went, especially over the years later. So, stories about, well, was it this person or was it that person? Instead of stories about, why hasn't law enforcement solved this? Like, why is this still a question we don't know the answer to?
Was that the spark, Madeleine, that kind of made you think there's more here? There is an investigative story to told. There's something to pitch and tell the world about, that there was this gigantic search in all these hours in this national story, if I understand correctly. It was a national story at the time.
Right.
And yet it didn't turn up results. Was it that element that made you start to question and ask why?
Yeah. And basically investigative reporting often starts with a really simple question. And the simple question in this case was, why hasn't this case been solved?
Right.
And the reason why we were so interested in that answer is because of the national importance of the case, that, this was a case that led to federal law on sex offender registries. And it was one of the handful of cases that really fueled the whole fear and paranoia in American life about stranger danger. So it really did have this national impact that you can trace back to what happened on this dead-end road in central Minnesota.
All right, so you stumble across this story, you start doing some research, you see a potential something to investigate here, you pitch it to your editors. Take us from there. How do you go from that point to releasing episode 1? I assume it starts with assembling some people.
Yes. So, and actually, before I even talked to my editors about it, I talked to a producer who also works at American Public Media, who's amazing. Her name is Samara Freemark. And I just went to go grab coffee with her one day, and we were talking about other stuff. And I said, there's this story that I've kind of been interested in. And I just started to talk to her about it, and she was very interested. And so we teamed up on this. And so it was me and Samara, and then we brought on an associate producer, Natalie Jablonski, and then the larger team that we work with also pitched in. So we had a data reporter, other reporters, web people, kind of coming in and out of the story throughout. So, what we started out doing is just going and talking to people, talking to, law enforcement who worked on the case back then, law enforcement who work on it now, the Wetterling family, people who knew Jacob, other people, who'd been harmed in that area. And it just, you just kind of just start out. You don't know what you're going to find. So you just have to get started and see where it leads you. It might not lead you anywhere. It might lead you to a totally different conclusion. But in this case, the more we found out, the further along we were to this eventual conclusion that this was a failed investigation.
What's that process like? I mean, because it had been so many years. You start going to all these people who may not have been talked to for a while,
or ever in some cases.
Yeah, right. Did you get some odd looks? Did people kind of look at you like, why are we talking about this again? Because it was 1989 that the abduction occurred. So, and this is 2016, right? Did you begin in 2015? Did this process start?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we're in 2015. So we're dealing with 26 years after the fact. What's that process like, approaching some of these family members, investigators, potential witnesses with, hey, this thing that happened so long ago?
Yeah, so you just introduce yourself and say, why you're interested, that you're trying to understand what really happened. I with the case of the Wetterlings, we interviewed them multiple times because we wanted to really understand in a way that I don't know had been fully told before, just the toll that it takes on a family and the complications that arise from this, and that it's not just, that the role that this plays and the not knowing and what it can do to a marriage. We wanted to tell that part. So you just start out, meeting with people. Some people you meet up with first to get coffee or just talk. And then you kind of go from there, and, one person leads you to another person. The thing we kept coming across over and over were people who'd never been talked to before. And they were pretty receptive to talking, which made the failure of law enforcement to contact them all the more interesting to us, because it wasn't as though we were like prying information out of these people. It was like, oh, now that you mention it, yeah, I always thought this was weird. Like it wasn't the result of hours of, trying to get them to answer questions. And then, we just kind of proceeded. And then the other thing we were doing at the same time is I was reading all the news coverage of this case from the very beginning, which for this case was a big undertaking because there were just thousands and thousands of stories. So we had like long lists of people that we wanted to interview, and we would just go through the list, and, number of the people had passed away. We'd try to contact their family members, I'm talking about like law enforcement in this case,
Right.
And we just kind of go through this list and just keep interviewing. You keep adding people's names to the list and keep doing more interviewing people again. And then the story just leads you where it leads you. But you just don't know what you're going to find. And so you just have to be open to being wrong or open to the story not being what you think. I mean, for us, one of the surprising things was to find, like I say in the podcast, this one day at the Stearns County Archives, just this filing cabinet with this bottom drawer that was labeled crime. And then I open it, and there are all these other unsolved cases in it, just like folder after folder of unsolved murders in this county. So we started out, like, we're looking at the Jacob Wetterling case. And we did not know that there were these other unsolved crimes, and then we just kind of stumbled upon them.
This week's episode of the Podcast Digest is brought to you by Podbean. I've been telling you about them for the last couple of weeks, and with good reason. Well, what are they? They are podcast hosting and monetization. That means if you're another podcaster, and I know a lot of you podcasters are listening, or you're just a super fan like I was before I started the Podcast Digest, and you're thinking about starting your own show, I would strongly encourage you to check out Podbean. They offer a ton of great features. If you sign up with Podbean, and you can use a very special URL, podbean.com/TPD. You're going to learn more about this great service as well as get your first month free. But Podbean's going to provide you with a website for your show. It's got customizable themes and colors. When you publish an episode with them, they're going to have automatic social sharing, along with really nice embeddable players for your show. Or if you've already got a website, it can integrate with that. You're, of course, going to get all the standard RSS and iTunes support. You can import your show or redirect it if you're coming from another hosting provider. You could potentially get set up with a mobile application for Android or iOS. You're going to get great stats, and I've been saying this for a while now. Stats are kind of my deep, dark secret. I love the statistics, and you can get those all from Podbean as well. You're going to have integrated monetization tools. You can have certain episodes set as premium content. They provide an advertising platform, even your own patron program, all available right there within Podbean. There is also a directory right through Podbean of all the other great shows and some promotional opportunities as well to kind of push your show's exposure even higher. There are a ton of great features and reasons to make sure that Podbean is on your list if you're looking for a new home for your show or considering starting your own. Again, go to podbean.com/TPD. That's for the Podcast Digest, TPD. You're going to get all this information in website form, And if you sign up, your first month is going to be free. My thanks to Podbean for supporting the Podcast Digest. Now back to the show. At what point, Madeleine, during this process, you guys start looking at, witnesses, family members, people, investigators, people, in the sheriff's department, et cetera? Talk to me about the evolution of what ultimately became sort of the through line of this story, because you mentioned early on it wasn't necessarily, you guys weren't setting out to sort of uncover or sort of shed light on what type of job law enforcement did, but that obviously was one of the main thematic elements by the end. But take us through sort of how that evolution occurred during your reporting.
Yeah, so, we started out with this question of why wasn't this case solved? And over time, it became clear, like, for example, this really basic question, did they talk to everybody in the neighborhood that night? We didn't know, we had no reason to think that they didn't. But when we found out that, in fact, they had not talked to everyone in the neighborhood that night, that was certainly, surprising to us, and was one of these things that was building this eventual conclusion that something was seriously wrong here. So there were a lot of moments like that. I think that was a particularly surprising one because it was such a basic failure, and it was something that everyone we talked to assumed had happened. All the law enforcement. Like, oh yeah, that definitely happened. Yes, I'm sure it did. And it turned out that it hadn't happened. And so you find out things like that. You try to find out why it didn't happen. And then there were just more and more things like that. And of course, the whole time we're doing this part of the reporting, we still don't know who did it. So we're just collecting these examples of law enforcement parts of the investigation that appear to fall well outside of best practices for law enforcement. But what we didn't know was which one, like, what were the top 5 that actually mattered?
Right.
Like, maybe it didn't matter if they canvassed the neighborhood that night. Maybe that actually wouldn't have helped them. They should have done it as like a basic thing that you do at a crime scene. But without knowing who did it, it was a more complicated scenario to determine what to exclude, what to include. And then, of course, we had the confession, and that immediately clarified a number of those things.
It would seem very easy to me, either in your reporting or in the narration for each episode, to very easily take a mindset, of this sort of like head slapping, like, are you kidding me? This wasn't done. Because you contrast the story of all the resources, these hundreds of people searching fields, and yet there's like a dozen people on the cul-de-sac that never got talked to, or at least not in the first week or two.
Right.
So it's like, but you guys didn't do that, or you didn't hammer that per se. You didn't strike that right between the eyes. Was that sort of a concerted decision? What's the thought process? Because you guys know that your listeners are hearing this, exasperatedly in terms of like, are you serious? But
right.
You guys took a much more sort of objective view of it.
Yeah, I mean, we were just, I guess, being reporters about it. So, there were, like, people are, people can react to it however they're going to react to it. I mean, it's not our job to editorialize on top of the facts. I mean, I think this is a classic example of the facts speak for themselves.
Right.
But we also didn't shy away from some pretty firm conclusions. We didn't, for example, leave it an open question as to whether or not we thought the investigation was botched.
Right.
Or, whether or not things could have happened in a different way. So I think there's a line in reporting. You don't want to editorialize, but you also don't want to shy away from just saying what the facts are showing.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, and it's funny because at a couple of points, it's towards the end of the the 9-episode run, as you're digging further in. The reason I asked the prior question was it seemed to me at a point that in the process that you and the team may have gone a little more that direction. Maybe that's what you're referring to, the sort of not shying away. Like you start to zero in on some of these individuals who said, well, maybe that wasn't done, or I'm not sure if that was done. And you guys kind of do say, why? Like, why wouldn't it have been type deal?
And we also are trying to build this experience. So by the time we started writing, we had already finished the reporting, but yet what we're trying to do is take listeners along on this process with us, instead of just saying up front, these are the 25 things we learned that you're about to hear in this podcast, because who would want that? That's not a good way to tell anyone any information. So we wanted
it's a much shorter story, right? Much shorter story. Yes.
So we wanted to build, to this conclusion at a point where we thought, people would be moving in that direction with us, as opposed to just saying what we said at the end of episode 8, for example, at the beginning of the whole series.
Yeah, and talk about change in direction. I think it's time we go ahead and talk about the elephant in the room, because I'm really curious. I imagine a lot of people who have heard this series are. Most people are aware that everything sort of changed late in the game. Can you talk to us a little bit about the timeline, how that kind of switch happened, and what you guys in the back room were doing at that point in terms of what do we do?
Yeah, so we had been basically finishing up the podcast with 8 episodes, and we had released a video trailer of the series, and we're set to release the first episode the following week, I believe, or maybe the week after that. And it was done. The episode is done. And then, we found out that actually there had been a confession in the case, that this man, Danny Heinrich, who we were very familiar with, who had been a suspect for a long time, had he had taken a plea deal, and he had led authorities to the remains of Jacob, right outside this town of Painesville. And so from there, so we hadn't released any episodes yet. And what was really, I guess, important for answering this question of why this case hadn't been solved, which shifted slightly, of course, to why did it take 27 years, was the one thing we did not know, of course, was who did it. And so by knowing who did it and how they did it, we could suddenly make much better sense out of some of the findings of our investigation. So, for example, Dan Rassier, the guy who lived across from the abduction site, who had maintained for years that he saw a blue car that night, right around the time of the abduction, come down his driveway and turn around. Well, it turns out that the man who confessed said, yeah, drove to the site, turned around. We know he had a blue car. So the failure to pay attention to what Dan was saying was so clear, the just the massive nature of that mistake versus, well, who knows who did it? Who knows if they had a car or not? So maybe Dan saw the abductor's car, but maybe not. So it removed that kind of ambiguity from the story. And timing-wise, we were able to adjust pretty quickly because we had done a fair amount of reporting on Danny Heinrich before, although he was not going to be at all the focus of the podcast. So we were able to go in and insert these facts and tighten up the writing and do a little extra reporting once we knew what had happened.
I've been dying to ask you this question, Madeleine, ever since I started listening to this show, and I heard about sort of the change you guys had to do because of the confession that came out. And I'm wondering what you guys think personally, or if you're even willing to go this far, because it seems like in my head I am. All this time that you guys spent asking all these people all these questions and digging and preparing a story, do you think that pushed Danny Heinrich to ultimately confess because he knew this story was about to get a whole new light shown upon it?
I have no idea. We just don't know why on that particular day he decided to talk. He was in jail. He was awaiting trial on federal charges of child pornography. The thinking of law enforcement was, well, if he is the one who did it, this would be a time for him to confess because he might be able to get a plea deal out of it. But we don't know why it came together when it did. I mean, we were definitely done with all of our reporting by then. We'd interviewed law enforcement. They knew what our findings were and all of that. But why, whether it had anything to do with it, we have no idea.
It always makes me wonder, if one of those officers or people, sort of talking to him about, hey, is there anything else you need to tell us type deal, said, look, and I've spent the last couple of months, few hours now talking to reporters, da, 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 da. I don't know. It's this story in my mind. And it almost makes me think that if that is true, or if any part in the back of his brain chose this time to come forward with any sense of the reporting that you folks have done and what ultimately came out, that it's a really unique kind of full circle experience in this, that what In the Dark sort of talks about all along is, in a lot of ways, what law enforcement didn't do, and maybe they didn't look in the right places and ask the right questions. And if we accept that as the case, there's almost an argument to be made that you guys did, and this is what happened. I don't know. Maybe it's a stretch. Maybe I'm connecting dots that shouldn't be connected, but that's what I was thinking as a listener.
Yeah, we just don't know. And if we find out, we'll definitely let everyone know. But it really was striking how, we didn't set out to solve this case. We really did not. And
Right.
So, we were really investigating the investigation. And then in the course of that, of course, you come across Danny Heinrich and a couple other people who didn't do it. But we just really did not see that as our jobs. In the same way, that's the job of law enforcement.
Right.
And I think there's sometimes a way in which, so much of a focus on the part of the reporter as to, was it this person or that person, can cause us to lose sight of the fact that there is actually a person whose job it is to do this. And there's something about, I think, the accessibility of crime and the fact that it is possible for, an amateur to solve some crimes that make us not treat it in the same way that we would other professions. An example I kept thinking of with this story is, if I were reporting on, a problem with a hospital, a problem with heart surgeons, I wouldn't scrub in and try to do a heart surgery.
No,
it's just nothing.
That wouldn't be a good idea.
It would be terrible. But, for everyone. But also, it gets to this point of but there's something different about detective work where we think, let me just jump in there. And there's reasons, because, there are people who have been very successful with that. Earl Morris has been very, so there's reasons, but it also comes at the risk, if we only focus on that, we do not focus enough on law enforcement, the people, this is their job.
I want to ask you, Madeleine, a little bit about you and Samara's experience personally going through this process. We've talked a lot about, obviously Jacob's at the center of this story, and then ultimately it's about Danny Heinrich, what he did, and law enforcement and what they did or didn't do. But as you mentioned earlier, a few minutes back, there's a lot of other stories here. You talked about Jacob's parents, and there's a heartbreaking episode in there about them having the phone on in their house and taking these calls and dealing with psychics. And I don't want to give too much away, folks, because if you haven't heard it, you need to. But there's that. And then you mentioned also Dan Rassier and he talks about his experience and being sort of a person of interest. And there's so many personal stories that you guys have touched upon and reported. What was the experience like for you guys, kind of, emotionally sort of putting this story together?
Well, I'm always hesitant on this topic because, it's not something that happened to me,
Right.
So as a reporter, this is my job. I do this and I go out and talk to people who are the people who've been harmed and traumatized. And I try to gather those stories and make sense of them. So, I think that, of course, there are moments of the reporting that are difficult because, you're a reporter, you're also a human being.
Right.
But I was also just very hesitant, always very aware of the sort of boundary between me as a reporter versus this person whose actually, this is their life.
Right.
I think that, if you're doing it that way, then maybe it helps you as well to observe what is actually happening. If you don't kind of step on that space. So, when we were interviewing the Wetterlings, to just to kind of watch, it unfold as they tried to talk about that night and to talk about what happened. Their conversation with each other in a lot of ways was more interesting than, anything else that was happening in that interview. So I think it's just, of course, you're affected by these stories, and of course they're upsetting stories, but I also see it as, my job, and ultimately there's such a huge gulf between whatever, difficult emotions I might have while reporting it and the emotions of the people directly involved.
Maybe a better question would be that, you've done investigative journalism for a while, covering a range of topics you described right up front, but going through this one and this process, did this even open your eyes to a degree on some of the habits and practices of law enforcement?
Yeah, and I think too, what it made me think a lot about is what it would be like to not to have a mystery this awful in your own family,
Right.
to not know what happened for so long. I mean, I have done a lot of thinking about that, because I as much as I've talked to the people who, the family members of Jacob, like it's still, I still feel like I just don't know what that would really be like, because I think it's somewhat different than knowing right away what happened. It has all these other things that come with it than not knowing. The speculation, trying not to speculate or trying to speculate so you can get an answer, the constant ringing of the phone. I mean, I thought a lot about that, that what a burden that would be to have this phone that rings in your house and, it's these people who are telling you awful things that they are saying happened to your son. And you are basically obligated, you feel obligated to take notes and to pass it along. And, it's this like horrific assignment, and it interrupts, all moments of your life. They got calls in the middle of the night. And I think that, as much as we report a lot on crime, I think that, even as much reporting as we do, it's still somewhat not as clear as it could be the actual impact on families in cases like this.
There was something about that phone in the house story that really resonated with me. I don't know if it's because it's 2016 and that was 1989, or even for 1989. I can't imagine that if you have a child that turns up missing, what happens is a phone line gets put in your house that you have to keep answering. You know what I mean? Like it just was disconnected from any understanding of any real experience I'd ever heard of, and it was amazing listening to the parents talk about what that experience was like, because like you said, you sit there and it rings again and you think to yourself, you don't want to have this conversation right now, but how do you not?
Right. And you want to do everything. You want to go on talk shows. You want to do, every last thing that you can do, no matter how painful it is, you're going to do it, because you're going to want to do those painful things because you want, like, the only thing you want is to find your son. So but yes, this intrusion in their lives, and the fact that so many people called them too.
Not all of them sane.
A full range of humanity called them.
There you go. Yes, a full range.
With people, people who thought they were being helpful to people where it's hard to believe they did think they were being helpful. But just the desperation of that moment and the fact that, okay, a lot of these tips seem ridiculous, but what if one of them isn't?
Right. Exactly. It's that what if that kept them answering all the time. What if this is the one?
Exactly.
It's an unbelievable story. And I want to talk about another element here we sort of touched upon, where the original story was supposed to be 8 episodes. And then the 9th was added when that, I guess, revelation came forward. But correct me if I'm wrong, was it as soon as you got the confession you thought it would be 9, or during the September and October of 2016, you realized somewhere during its release calendar that, there may be a 9th here?
So it was so as soon as there was a confession, so I went to the courthouse that day. I was in this, overflow room of the courthouse watching on this video feed while Danny Heinrich confessed. And while I was sitting there, it was, there's a lot to process in that moment, but there were things immediately that I was skeptical of just as a reporter, how this crime was unfolding. There were things that were being said that I'd never heard before. And so we just started, in addition to revising and adding things and removing things from the existing episodes, we also started doing additional reporting on Danny Heinrich, on the confession, on the site where he says the crime happened. And we didn't know what would come of that. So we didn't know, that day in the courtroom that there would be another episode. It was, something that maybe at least a month or so later, we started to talk more about as we found out more and more things and really crystallized, maybe 2 or 3 weeks before we decided to actually do it. Because what we didn't want to do, if we didn't have something significant to say about that, we wouldn't have done it. But it turned out that there was a lot there. And I think one of the things that worked for us, I think, in the structure was that it allowed us to go back to the story, versus leaving things where they were left in episode 8, where we're not in the Wetterling story.
Yeah, it was episode 9, I think, ironically enough, is one of my favorite episodes. I'm so happy that you guys had added it in. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, episode 9 is where you do cover that confession.
Right.
And I just got to say, your narration and retelling of that is not only riveting but disturbing, and it's it just really hits home in terms of bringing the reality of what really happened here to a whole nother level, and it was powerful, and you and the team did an excellent job with that and that topic and how you guys presented it, and so from one listener, I'm very happy you guys made that decision, because I think it really did kind of tie everything up in a different way than if that hadn't happened.
Yeah, and there was this portrayal of Danny Heinrich that was out there then, starting with with the announcement of the plea deal, which was, he's a loner. He's really did a great job in committing this crime in terms of concealing it, that this was in a very remote location. And, there was a lot of that we thought there was a real public interest in saying, like, well, let's find out if that's really true.
Because it was really none of that, right?
Exactly. And also because of what that means. What that means is that, there were people to talk to, and there were places to visit that could have been quite helpful to the investigators. Instead of, again, this portrayal of this as an epic mystery. It's like, well, no, like, he did have friends, and like, we did talk to a number of them, and he invited people over and, all kinds of things. It's hard to understand why those people weren't talked to, and how, if we talk about the murder site, why that site wouldn't have already been examined.
It's unbelievable, folks. If you haven't heard this, the brazenness of him will just blow your mind. Some of the things he did or retells doing that night, you're like, are you kidding me? And then went back, what was it, like a year later, and found stuff lying on the ground, like, oh, maybe I should pick that up. And it's unbelievable. And then not to mention other victims that you guys talked to that he had interaction with. These stories were out there, these actions that he did, and like you said, what that says about sort of the law enforcement assigned to these type of cases and issues. It's mind-blowing. It really is.
Yeah, and there's also like an undercurrent too of, there are these kids that are having these terrible things happen to them in this county. And it's not that they're not being believed, but in some cases it doesn't seem like the adults aren't panicking about this. And the kids are the ones in a lot of cases who are saying to their parents, that whole thing we're hearing about on the news with this kid, Jacob, like, I think that might be the same as that guy who attacked me, and maybe we should, maybe you could drive me over to the command center and we could talk to them. Because the kids are recognizing that there were similarities, even though law enforcement wasn't, in a lot of cases, contacting them directly.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm looking at some of the description of episodes, Madeleine. Episode 6, one of the early write-ups you guys have here, says, in the 70s and early 80s, missing children weren't considered a policing priority. You couldn't even enter missing child information into the FBI's National Crime Database, but that changed quickly. I can't even envision a world where missing children at a time was not like a major thing. And I don't know, maybe I would have enjoyed those days where those were not a concern, but it sounds almost like it was happening, but like you said, it just didn't have the attention on it.
Yeah, and by the time Jacob was kidnapped, it really did. I mean, then it wasn't, at that moment, 1989 was sort of at the height of a cultural obsession with child abductions. But these earlier cases that we looked at just seemed very different in how they were, not that they weren't investigated, because they definitely were, but they did not have the kind of ability to instill fear in adults that some of these other cases had. The kids were certainly terrified, in the town of Painesville, but the adults didn't seem to share that same level of terror. It was just a completely different time. I mean, things that we take for granted now as just like realities of American childhood were not the case in the 70s. I mean, it didn't always used to be the case that parents, wouldn't let their kids out of their sight, or, younger kids couldn't walk home from school by themselves, or things like that. It was very different before this moment of this panic, and it really was just a handful of cases that changed American childhood, because this is a really rare crime. It wasn't as though all of a sudden this started happening everywhere. It was just that for whatever reason, these cases caught on, these handful of cases, and made people much more scared of this very rare thing happening than things that were much more likely to happen, like car accidents or something like that.
And you can't help but think that people like Danny Heinrich knew that, right? Knew that there was this susceptible portion of society that was victimizable, and yet they may, scream to the mountaintops, but it would be poo-pooed and not have its attention. And it seems like somebody like him recognized that element culturally and feasted on it for years.
Yeah, I don't know, because one of the more puzzling things about this, so the Painesville police did investigate these crimes before Jacob, these other kids who were being assaulted. It was the front page of the local paper. There are detailed police reports that we obtained, but they just couldn't solve it. And so I guess I imagine, what is going through Danny Heinrich's mind? He's living in Painesville. There are about 2,000 people in the entire town. He's seeing this on the front page of the news. He lives right downtown on one of the main streets. All of this stuff is happening. He's doing this to kids within just a couple blocks of his apartment, and he's not getting caught, and then he goes and becomes, more brazen still and abducts a kid and doesn't get caught. And then he abducts and murders a kid and doesn't get caught. And all along he's observing this massive investigation. And I just wonder what is going through his mind.
I mean, I guess the area and the country and the world must be, counting their lucky stars that he didn't continue to go further and further and further, at least that we know about. Because if somebody's empowered to the point that he feels as if he can pretty much do anything, who knows what he was been capable of.
Yeah, and we just don't know. I mean, one thing, we did find clear evidence that he continued to be interested in following around kids. But, did he commit other crimes? We just do not know the answer to that, because one of the conditions of the plea deal, in that moment at least, was that they would not ask about any other cases other than Jacob and Jared, the kid who was abducted and released earlier that year.
That plea deal, that's something that I imagine a lot of people had opinions on. And that sort of segues to one of my final questions here, Madeleine. From what I can tell from the outside, it appears that In the Dark's been very well received. From sitting in your chair, what's the reception been like?
I would agree. Yeah, I mean, we've heard from people, of course, in Minnesota, but also across the country and also from other countries who have written to thank us and say, something that we really were hoping we would be a message from this, that this has made them think more critically about their law enforcement agency. It's made them look up the clearance rates for the agency where they live. It's made them think, why aren't we more focused on crime solving? Why aren't we asking these questions? Not just in this one town in central Minnesota, but, everywhere. So there's been, that's been very gratifying, because that's why we were doing this, to get this kind of conversation going and tell people what was happening. And, we've also heard from, the people, have not heard from the sheriff's office, but I've heard from other people who are featured prominently in the story, who have been grateful to have that full story told. So, but yeah, the reaction has been good to hear. And also, I think what it shows is that people want these kind of stories. People understand that the criminal justice system is complicated and worth delving into, and that there are injustices that are committed that need to be exposed, and that sometimes it takes more than 5 minutes or even an hour to understand what those injustices are. And so I've just been very grateful that people were sticking through the podcast from episodes 1 all the way through 9 to go on this journey.
Has there been any blowback from local law enforcement? Have you guys gotten any strongly worded letters or anything like that?
Nothing.
Why do you think that is?
I have no idea. I mean,
they got their man and they don't want to talk about it anymore, basically, you think?
I don't know. Yeah. I would like to know. I mean, I would still, of course, like to interview the sheriff again now that the case has been solved, but he hasn't gotten back to me.
Right. Yeah. Something tells me that might not happen. He's the one that wouldn't talk to you much at all, right?
Well, he did talk pretty extensively to us in the podcast.
I'm mixing up my people.
For a couple of hours. I mean, so he, and a lot of law enforcement did talk to us. We just haven't heard from the sheriff after, since the podcast started airing, in any way. We do have requests in to the sheriff's office for, the investigative file when that is eventually released, which will probably take a long time because there'll be redactions that are needed of, children's names and other personal information. But so we have requests into the sheriff's office, but they haven't returned our requests for interviews or other, questions we've had, things like that.
Oh, that obviously leads to the next one. For folks who have really enjoyed and taken something away from the experience of what you and Samara and the team have produced, are there more episodes in the future, or what is the future for this line? Do we expect a new story at some point, or?
So we're still trying to figure out what our next project will be. Right now, we've just wrapped up the last episode in this story, so that's what we're in the process of figuring out now. Taking like a bit of a breather, and then also figuring out what's next. So we will keep people posted. But yeah, at this point, we're not quite sure what our next project will be and what that will look like.
But is it a foregone conclusion, or still in the discussion phase, that you guys may move on to another investigative piece, a crime type thing, or are we still too early to even go that far?
Too early to say. I mean, okay. Yeah, we just don't know at this point. I mean, we're starting to talk about what we might do, but it's still very early because, we were just a couple days out of the last episode.
And which is why folks should go back and check it all out at this point. This is completely bingeable Netflix style, folks. You can easily sort of, if you've not yet jumped on the In the Dark train, you can start right from episode 1 and go all the way through. It is an amazing story about so many elements, and I think I've seen that feedback, people talking about the show, is that you guys have done such a phenomenal job covering a lot of the elements that we've discussed, what the parents felt, what, the wrongly accused or wrongly targeted felt, the crime itself, other boys in the area who were victims. You guys did such an amazing job. And I hope you guys do take that well-deserved break because, boy, have you and the team have earned it, Madeleine.
Well, thanks. And thanks for listening.
Absolutely. And I've told a bunch of people about it. I recommended it on my recommendation show a few weeks back.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, I hope, have jumped over. But if somebody hasn't heard In the Dark and would like to get to know this story and get to know the work that you guys have done, how do they find it?
It's on iTunes. It's also on, and a lot of other podcast apps as well. And it's also on our website, which is apmreports.org. And we have lots of extra content, too. So if people have finished listening to all the episodes in iTunes, there is a lot of other stuff online. There's videos, there's documents, and all kinds of stuff.
I was looking at some of that today. I was watching the video of the interview with the guy who was wrongly targeted, talking about his stress in trying to be able to obtain students for his music teaching, and he couldn't. And I was watching that video today and looking at the maps.
Yeah,
I was doing all that today. It's a great website, great information, and all of it top to bottom. If they want to learn more about what you're going to be doing in the future, Madeleine, I imagine you're on Twitter?
Yes, I am. It's just at Madeleine Baran. And we also have an email sign up on the APM Reports website, and that will also be sending out updates on that about what we're doing next, so people can sign up to that too.
Excellent. That was right there at the bottom of the 9 list. I saw that as well. And folks, there will be links in the show notes for all of this. APM Reports, is just a quick aside before I let you go. Is this sort of a newer name in the podcasting space? I'm sure it's been around a bit, but for podcasts, I know that Historically Black is out now. Another one I've been working through, partnership with Washington Post, and then you guys, In the Dark. Is this sort of an arm that we could look for potentially more shows coming out as well?
Yeah, so we are a national investigative unit that was created last year. So, and it combines a number of people that were already working at American Public Media and then a couple other people who weren't. And so we do all kinds of reporting. Some of it's in podcast form and some of it is in, non-podcast form, either digitally or in collaboration with other news organizations. But certainly it's something that I think all of us want to continue doing because this is a big growing audience that allows us to tell these complicated stories.
Yes, American Public Media. That was episode 102. Ben Brock Johnson, Claire Tennisgetter from Codebreaker were my guests then, and I asked Ben to attempt to explain to me the setup with APM and how this relates to that, and he struggled. So I'm not going to ask you to do, that as well.
I mean, the general thing is, American Public Media is a big public media organization, and as part of that, they have all kinds of reporting, including our investigative unit and things people might be very familiar with, such as Marketplace.
Yes, Marketplace, Dinner Party Download,
right? Splendid Table.
Yes. And it's great. And so, folks, if you've not heard of APM and all the work that they do, it's kind of hard to connect all the dots. But once you start to get into that world, there's so much good stuff out there. So, quick plug for them. Madeleine Baran, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome. Good to talk to you.
And folks, that'll do it. That'll do it for episode 115. What'd you guys think? Pretty cool conversation, right? Madeleine is so awesome. I can't wait to see what comes from her or APM Reports in the next chapter. I'm really, really anxious to see. They did such a great job with In the Dark. If you enjoyed this conversation, this episode of the Podcast Digest is 115. Share it to all the social things. Put it on your Instagram feed. Tell a friend on Facebook. Get more people checking out the Podcast Digest, guys. It really is the lifeblood of the show. And if you really enjoyed it, you can, of course, leave an iTunes review or, better yet, hop on over to Patreon and check out the Patreon campaign for the Podcast Digest. It's small, but I hope growing, and I'd love to have your support for as little as $1 a month over there. This week's show also brought to you, as I mentioned, by Podbean. If you're thinking of starting a podcast or looking for a great home for your current show, Podbean needs to be on your short list. Go to podbean.com/TPD. You get the first month free when you sign up with this special URL. You can try all of Podbean's great hosting features from doing that. That's it for episode 115, 116. Coming next week, another great interview. You're really going to like that one too. Until then, my name is Dan Lizette for the Podcast Digest.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at Pod Digest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.